There are countries that were born in a single moment, and there are countries that died slowly without knowing it. If you look at Venezuela in 1920, you are witnessing both events at once. A nation still dressed in colonial white, still moving at the pace of donkeys and coffee harvests, completely unaware that beneath its feet lay the substance that would change everything. In 1920, Venezuela was not a country of highways and skyscrapers. It was a country of red tile roofs and church bells. A place where time moved according to the seasons, where families measured wealth in coffee sacks, and where the biggest city felt more like a large town than a capital. Today, we are going to use technology to reconstruct this forgotten world. We will walk through the dusty streets of old Caracas, climb the coffee mountains of the Andes, and witness the exact moment when the old Venezuela began to vanish forever. To understand Venezuela in 1920, you need to understand what powered this nation before the black gold changed everything. Coffee, the brown gold. For decades, Venezuela had been one of the world's premier coffee exporters. The economy breathed according to the rhythm of the harvest. In the Andean highlands, entire families lived and died on coffee haciendas, picking beans under the tropical sun. These were not industrial operations, they were feudal worlds unto themselves. The hacendado, the landowner, was judge, employer, and king of his domain. Workers lived in small houses on the property, generation after generation, bound by debt and tradition. Life moved slowly here. A man might be born, work, marry, and die without ever leaving the boundaries of the hacienda. The mountains of Merida, Táchira, and Trujillo were dotted with these coffee kingdoms. Mule trains descended the steep paths carrying sacks of beans to the ports. The journey could take days. There were no trucks, no paved roads. Just men, mules, and mountains. The port of La Guaira was the gateway to the world. Ships from Europe and America anchored in the harbor, loading Venezuelan coffee bound for breakfast tables in Paris and New York. The dock workers moved cargo by hand, their bodies glistening under the Caribbean sun. The smell of salt mixed with the aroma of roasted beans that seemed to permeate everything. But coffee was not the only treasure. Cacao, the ancestor of chocolate, had made Venezuela famous centuries before. Venezuelan cacao was considered the finest in the world, a luxury product reserved for European aristocracy. The cacao haciendas spread across the coastal valleys, their workers harvesting pods that would become Swiss chocolates and Belgian pralines. Caracas in 1920 was a city of perhaps 100,000 souls. By today's standards, it was barely a town. The streets were mostly unpaved, turning to mud during the rainy season. Horse-drawn carriages and donkeys shared the roads with the occasional automobile, still a rare curiosity that made children run and point. The heart of the city was the Plaza Bolivar, named after the liberator. Here, under the shade of ancient trees, gentlemen in white linen suits discussed politics and business. Women in long dresses walked with parasols to shield themselves from the tropical sun. Life happened in the plaza, in the evening paseo, when the entire city seemed to come out to see and be seen. The architecture was pure colonial Spanish. Whitewashed walls, red clay roofs, wooden balconies with iron railings. The houses were built around central patios, cool refuges from the heat where families gathered and children played. Churches dominated the skyline, their bells marking the hours and calling the faithful to mass. Religion was not optional. It was the rhythm of existence. The Cathedral of Caracas stood as it had for centuries, a monument to a world that had barely changed since independence 100 years before. But if you looked carefully, you could see the cracks in this old world. The country was not free. It was held in the iron grip of Juan Vicente Gómez, a dictator who had seized power in 1908 and would not release it until his death in 1935. Gómez ruled from his hacienda in Maracay, rarely visiting Caracas. He trusted no one, saw enemies everywhere, and maintained control through a network of spies and brutal repression. Political prisoners filled the jails. Torture was common. Dissent was death. Yet for many Venezuelans, especially those in the countryside, Gómez was simply a distant figure. What mattered was the harvest, the weather, the price of coffee in distant markets they would never see. The government took its share and left them alone. It was a passive tyranny, effective precisely because most people had so little to lose. And then there was the secret that was beginning to emerge from the earth. In 1914, the first major oil discovery had occurred at Men Grande. Foreign companies, mostly from the United States and Britain, had begun arriving with strange machines and stranger accents. They set up camps near Lake Maracaibo, drilling holes in the earth, searching for something the locals did not fully understand. In 1920, the oil industry was still in its infancy. Production was modest. The workers were a mix of foreigners and bewildered locals who had never seen industrial machinery. The wooden derricks rose like skeletal fingers pointing at the sky, their purpose almost mystical to those who watched from nearby villages. But the signs of change were everywhere if you knew where to look. The oil companies paid in cash, in amounts that seemed fantastical to men who had known only coffee wages. Young men began leaving the haciendas, walking toward the drilling camps, toward this new thing that promised money beyond imagination. The transformation was beginning, drop by drop, barrel by barrel. In 1922, just 2 years after our snapshot, the famous Barrosos II well would blow in a spectacular gusher, spraying oil 100 feet into the air for 9 days before it could be controlled. That single event would announce to the world that Venezuela sat atop an ocean of petroleum. But in 1920, that future was still just a rumor, a possibility, a dream whispered among foreign engineers and ambitious officials. The common people knew nothing of what was coming. Life in the countryside continued as it had for generations. The markets of Caracas still overflowed with tropical fruits, fresh fish, and vegetables carried in from surrounding farms. Women haggled over prices in the morning cool, while vendors called out their wares. The smell of arepas cooking on clay griddles mixed with the scent of fresh coffee being roasted. This was a Venezuela of simple pleasures and simple hardships. Diseases that a modern medicine would later conquer still killed routinely. Malaria plagued the lowlands. Yellow fever lurked in the ports. Infant mortality was staggering by today's standards. Families had many children knowing that not all would survive. Death was a familiar neighbor, accepted with fatalistic faith. Education was a luxury available mostly to the urban elite. In the countryside, most children worked rather than studied. Literacy rates were low. The written word belonged to priests, lawyers, and the wealthy. Knowledge was passed orally, through stories told on hacienda porches, through songs sung during harvest, through traditions maintained by sheer repetition. Transportation beyond the major cities was an adventure. The roads, such as they were, became impassable mud pits during the rainy season. Rivers served as highways in some regions, with small boats carrying people and goods. A journey from Caracas to Maracaibo, which today takes an hour by plane, could take weeks of difficult travel. The isolation created distinct regional cultures. The llaneros of the vast plains lived a life centered on cattle ranching, essentially cowboys of the tropics. The Andean highlanders, with their coffee culture and cooler climate, developed their own traditions and even their own accent. The coastal people, mixed with Caribbean influences, had yet another character entirely. Venezuela in 1920 was not one country, but a patchwork of regions loosely held together by shared language and distant government. And into this world came the foreigners. Not just the oilmen, but merchants, adventurers, and dreamers from Europe and the Middle East. Many came through the open door of a country that needed skills and labor. They established shops in the cities, married local women, and began to weave their threads into the Venezuelan fabric. The Lebanese merchant, the Italian craftsman, the German engineer, they were the first trickles of what would become a flood of immigration in the decades to come. The ports buzzed with this international energy. Ships arrived carrying manufactured goods from the industrial world, fabrics, machines, medicines, and luxuries. They departed loaded with coffee, cacao, and increasingly, barrels of crude oil. Venezuela was slowly being connected to the global economy, though most of its people lived entirely outside that system. Women in 1920 Venezuela occupied a world with strict boundaries. Upper-class women were expected to be decorative and domestic, skilled in music and needlework, chaperoned at all times. Working-class women labored in markets, in domestic service, in the fields alongside men. There was no suffrage, no political voice, no higher education available. The church and tradition dictated a woman's place, and few dared to question it. Yet in the cities, subtle changes were beginning. The daughters of wealthy families heard of distant movements in Europe and North America. Some read forbidden books. Some dreamed of a different life. These were the seeds that would eventually grow into change. But in 1920, they were barely visible sprouts. Entertainment was local and live. There was no radio yet, no cinema outside the largest cities. People gathered for festivals, for religious celebrations, for the traditional dances like the joropo. Music was made by hand, with cuatro guitars, maracas, and harps. The corrido, the folk ballad, told stories of love and loss, of heroes and bandits. Every town had its musicians who played at weddings and funerals, and everything in between. The night sky over Venezuela in 1920 was impossibly bright with stars. No electric lights competed with the heavens. Families sat on their porches in the evening cool, watching the constellations wheel overhead, listening to the chorus of insects and frogs. The darkness was complete outside the few electrified zones of the capital. Kerosene lamps and candles lit the interiors of homes. People rose with the sun and slept when it set. The rhythm of life followed the rhythm of nature because there was no alternative. Children played in the streets and fields with toys made from what was available. Balls fashioned from rags, dolls carved from wood, hoops rolled with sticks. They learned early the work that would define their lives. The boys following fathers to fields or workshops, the girls shadowing mothers in the endless labor of running a home without modern conveniences. Every meal was cooked over fire. Every garment was washed by hand. Every drop of water was carried from well or stream. Yet there was joy in this hard life. The Venezuelan character, that famous warmth and humor, was already evident. Neighbors helped neighbors. Extended families lived in close proximity, sharing work and celebration. Loneliness was rare in a world where privacy was nearly impossible. And all of this, every red tile roof, every coffee harvest, every mass and market, every song and story, all of it stood on the edge of transformation. The Venezuela of 1920 was the last generation of the old world. Within a decade, oil would begin its total conquest of this nation. The money would flow, then flood, then drown everything that came before. The children playing in those unpaved streets in 1920 would live to see their country become the richest in South America. And then they would live to see it become one of the poorest. But in 1920, that roller coaster had not yet begun its climb. The Venezuela we see here exists in the quiet before the storm. The coffee still grows on the mountainsides. The dictator still rules from his hacienda. The priests still ring the bells. And beneath the earth, the oil waits, patient and black, preparing to change everything. This was Venezuela in 1920. A country of donkeys and cathedrals, of haciendas and hardship, of stars undimmed by electric light. A country that would soon disappear so completely that its own grandchildren would struggle to imagine it ever existed. If you want to see how that transformation happened, how the black gold swallowed everything the brown gold had built, subscribe to the channel for the next chapter of this story. Until then.